And on to this now, the Marshalltown building gutted by fire as a heritage, or was a heritage site, but the City of Johannesburg failed to protect it against illegal occupation and dilapidation. And the building was historically used as an influx control office. Later it housed the Usindiso Ministries women's shelter. To talk about the importance of preserving heritage, I'm joined by David Fleminger from the Johannesburg Heritage Foundation. David, thank you so much for your time. Of course, this tragedy, with many critics saying that it could have been avoided, considering that this building is owned by the City of Johannesburg and had been purposed for something else and left to be neglected and vandalized to the point where we see it now.
Yes, firstly, beyond any considerations of heritage, I think it's important to commemorate the lives that were lost in this tragedy. Whether it's a heritage building or not a heritage building, no structure should be left in such a condition whereby a fire can break out and cause this kind of loss of life. That's our first position I think we should agree on. The building itself was actually not necessarily abandoned as such. The problem for me is that it was let me give you a quick history. So the building was built in 1954 as the main pass office in Johannesburg. The pass system, for those who are thankfully too young to remember, was an influx control, as you said, Cindy, system whereby non-Europeans had to have employment in order to stay in the city overnight, and the pass office is where they got that pass. So it remained a pass office until 1986. When the pass laws were abolished, and then it was a provincial administration office for a couple of years before Usindiso Ministries took over and turned it into a women and children's shelter, a place of refuge, a safe haven, a place of peace and reconstruction, which we feel was a very appropriate use for the building. And in 2007, the building was given a blue plaque by the City of Johannesburg to commemorate its difficult past and also to celebrate its transformation into a place of safety.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
now, having taken that, sorry, David, sorry to interject, but just on that, the fact that it was a heritage site, it does have a very rich history, albeit some of it is in the dark days of apartheid, but nonetheless, it was a functioning building that had served even the needs of abandoned and abused women. So when did the neglect or the so-called building hijacking take place under the very watch of the City of Johannesburg?
That's where we get to the crux of the issue, for me anyway. We aren't sure of an exact date. I do know that in 2010, the building was being adopted by certain newspapers as their Mandela Day project. So there was certainly a lot of activity with Usindiso as late as 2010. Sometime after that, and I don't have a date exactly, hijackers moved in and literally forced Usindiso out. And once the hijackers and the slumlords moved in and pushed out the legitimate tenants of the building, or the leaseholders of the building, that's where the city should have gotten involved. Well, for me, the real failing is a failure to push back on these aggressive slumlords and building hijackers who have subsequently moved in, made the building ungovernable. And quite frankly, if the city and with its various authorities and its various police forces and whatever can't chase the slumlords out, who can? You know, what hope is there for buildings that have been hijacked if the city itself is not able to stand up to these guys?
Yeah, and David, we know now that there has been some sort of audit just to look at the inventory of what the assets of the city are, including buildings. We are told there is something in the region of almost 600 of these buildings that have been hijacked, and the tenants are forced, of course, to pay for rental up to a tune of 1,200 in a slump. Essentially, you know, a shack or an informal settlement within these buildings. So clearly there is a profile. There should be people to either follow in terms of that are perpetuating these kind of living conditions. Why do you think that the city hasn't done so as yet?
That's a difficult question for me to answer because there are a lot of issues at play here. I do know, for example, that the city in total has a portfolio of approximately 20,000 properties on its books. Those are all managed by the Johannesburg Property Company, and it's a huge portfolio. I mean, it's extremely difficult to manage 20,000 properties all over the city in various states of repair. So it is a big task. And I do think that the city needs to have an action plan in place to reward those properties that are being managed correctly, to acknowledge the properties that need help, and to step in with whatever force is necessary to really stand up to these hijackers. Because the simple fact is this: once a building is hijacked, no money goes into services. There's no water. There's no electricity. There's people are being squeezed into these buildings. They're using candles. They're using paraffin stoves. The chances of a fire are extremely high, and this is going to happen again. So whatever they discuss and whatever the discussion groups come up with, it needs to be an action plan with an emphasis on action, because this is going to happen again. There are buildings in a similar condition all over the place. And the city really needs to find a way to effectively combat the scourge of hijacked buildings.
Yeah, is it fair that indeed we are harboring probably the most sophisticated and dangerous criminals, and these kind of syndicates have its tentacles all over the continent and around the world, to the point where the South African Police Service, by their own admission, are outnumbered and do not have the capacity or arsenal to even fight back, let alone the case of Zamazamas, but also another indication that the police services is poorly resourced and incapacitated?
That unfortunately does seem to be the case, Cindy. I mean, as I said a little bit earlier, if the police can't step in and stand up to these slumlords and get them kicked out of the building, who will? Who else is there? Perhaps the army needs to be called in. I'm not sure, and I'm not underestimating the danger of these slumlords, because if nothing else, they may be sophisticated or not, but they are well armed, and they are not afraid to use violence to get what they want. However, we do have to respond. We can't just sit back, as the city has done, for 4, 5, 6 years or more, and just let these buildings go further and further down the drain. And that is challenging. It's challenging, but that's the nub of it. That's the point.
Yeah. And what does the policy say when it comes to heritage sites or key points of national importance that needs to be preserved? And not that any other property is less important, but is there a sort of focus in ensuring that we conserve and preserve not only heritage sites, but also indigenous knowledge systems, and where these buildings, or the significance thereof as well, David?
Yes. So national heritage legislation has quite a good baseline. Any structure older than 60 years is automatically heritage. And that means that you may not alter it, you may not develop it, you may not demolish it without permission from the relevant provincial heritage resource agency, beg your pardon. So there are built-in safeguards for our heritage sites, as well as our non-tangible heritage, that should be supported by the various authorities, the various cities, the various provincial authorities. That is in place. In reality, it's not quite as simple as that. There is a lot of people doing things, under the cover of darkness, so to speak, and we simply don't have enough feet on the ground or eyes on the ground to make sure that everybody's obeying the heritage legislation. As the Heritage Foundation, our mission is to acknowledge, commemorate, celebrate, and make accessible the heritage of our city for its citizens. We believe that by celebrating and by commemorating heritage, we can enrich the lives of those currently living in the city, as well as commemorate the lives of those who have previously lived in the city, so that we may be here today. So the preservation of heritage is very important, both from a historical point of view, from an emotional point of view, And also, these are buildings that have a potential use. So we always look for ways to reuse heritage buildings that may have outlived their initial purpose, because these are resources that can be used. We don't believe in just knocking things down and leaving them to rot. We believe in reuse and moving forward, built on what we have of the past.
David, really, really appreciate it. I know a lot of us look back with nostalgia as to what Johannesburg used to be, particularly your Hillbrow, Yeovil. It was an upwardly mobile, middle-class, integrated community, and it's really a shadow of what it is today. But thank you for your time. That's David Fleminger from the Johannesburg Heritage Foundation.